You tell me when. We good? Last week, we started this series on Daniel, on the first chapter of Daniel, and we are going to, good? All right. And we're going to continue that today on the second part of that. Our text is still the same text, so we won't reread it, but it's the first chapter of Daniel. I'd encourage you, if you haven't read it in a while, to go and read the book of Daniel. It's not a very long book. It's a very interesting book, fascinating book of history, and fascinating people involved in that. Tremendously fascinating. I mean, many of the people mentioned in that book are historically well known. There's a lot of people that are important in the Bible that aren't necessarily important in history, or at least not secular history. You're not going to find their name in a secular history book, perhaps. But there's a lot of names in the book of Daniel that are very well known and are very important in world history. And so definitely read the book of Daniel. We're discussing the first chapter of Daniel, which is where Nebuchadnezzar has gone up to Jerusalem, and he has laid siege on Jerusalem, and he's hauled away the artifacts of the temple, or some of the artifacts of the temple, the vessels, the things that the Jews used in the temple to do their sacrifices with. But he's also gone around and he has recruited, if you will, he has forcefully recruited, he's drafted, would be the best word, he's drafted all the young intellectual men of Israel that he can find, the leading candidates. He wants the smartest ones he can find. He didn't go looking for the strongest warriors. He didn't go looking for the best farmers. He didn't go looking for the greatest inventors. What he wanted was the smartest people that Israel had to offer. And we talked about last week, we talked about how Israel, because of their long history of reading and of discussion and argumentation and thinking and logical pursuit, had become a people with a disproportionate amount of intellectuals. And they still are that way today. Ashkenazi Jews still have the highest average IQ in the world. They still are disproportionate amongst all the intellectual endeavors practically, especially among Nobel Prize winners. Jews are disproportionate amount of the winners of Nobel Prizes. And so they still have that benefit or that advantage in the world today. And I believe that Babylon, or Nebuchadnezzar, he understood this, he knew this, and he went there, and one of his primary purposes in this first trip, this first siege, was to draft into his think tank that he had in Babylon, into his court advisors, these very intelligent people. And Daniel was one of them. And you have his three friends that are mentioned. You all know the story of his three friends that refused to bow to that idol, and they're cast into that fiery furnace. They were also taken with Daniel along with others. And so that's where we're at. And we talked about how they were swept away by Babylon. Jerusalem thought they were safe. They're up in the mountains. They have their walls. They have their religion. They have the Ark of the Covenant. They have God. And they think no one can touch us. And Babylon came in and just swept them away into captivity. And that's where we ended out last week. And today I want to talk to you what I've called culture shock. And so I want to I would like for you to put your mind, or put your mind's eye on Daniel, who's probably somewhere around 13 years old at this time. Highly intellectual, very talented, very, very capable, and surely by this time had a lot of plans for his life that were no longer going to work out. And here's Daniel, 13 years old, and we're picking up on the story. He's been captured by Nebuchadnezzar. He's been hauled off to Babylon, and that's where we're going to pick up on the story where we're at. I would like for you to consider for a moment, try to picture for a moment what Babylon is at this time. Babylon, for those that don't know, is in Iraq. What is modern-day Iraq is where Babylon is at. It's actually been excavated by archaeologists quite a bit. There's a lot of the ruins that are now visible of that city. And so we actually know quite a bit about it outside of what we know of the Bible. We know both from the Bible and from historical archaeology. We know quite a bit about this city. It's a very interesting city. By the time Daniel is being led into this city, he is on the road to Babylon. He is approaching Babylon. At this point in time in human history, Babylon is the largest city in the world probably at that time. It's estimated that its population was at around 200 to 250,000 people, which is a lot of people at this time way back then, because there wasn't that many people on earth. I mean, the population of the world was a lot less. And so, you know, today a city of 200,000, well, that doesn't seem like a huge city. But at that time, that's an enormous city. That's the biggest city the world had ever seen up to that time. So you're talking about Daniel coming from a very small town of Jerusalem into a huge city of Babylon. Huge city. And not just huge in population, it was a very large city. It at least encompassed 2,200 acres of land. Very large city. And that's just the city portion. And then they had another wall further out, much larger, where they had walled in all of their fields so that they couldn't be starved out in a siege. They could actually go out inside of their walled city, and they could plant and harvest enough food to feed the city, because Babylon had suffered a siege earlier by the Sumerians and had been starved into submission. So they didn't want that to happen again. So they built that bigger wall further out, built and encompassing in all their farmland. So the city within this into that outer wall was very large, and it's hard to know exactly. There are many different contemporary accounts of that conflict, but you're looking at maybe 40 square miles of land that this wall was built around. And the walls of Babylon are truly incredible. In fact, for a period of time, the walls of Babylon were on the list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They were later on replaced by the lighthouse, but for a time they were considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. Huge walls. The low estimate, because there's again a range of contemporary accounts, but the low side of it, the conservative estimate, is that these walls were 40 feet high. That's very high. And 32 feet thick. They would, according to contemporary accounts, they would hold chariot races on top of the walls, racing around the city. They say that even where they had guard towers, the walls were thick enough on top to turn a chariot with 4 horses around on top. Huge walls. They were considered impenetrable. Babylon was considered a city that could not be taken, which is why we find later in the book such nonchalance when they are being besieged by the Medes, right? But anyways, that was a city, huge, huge cities. You're coming up on, you're Daniel, you're 13 years old. You've never left your hometown. You live in this little town that's a religious town. All the town is about serving God. That's who you are. You're Daniel. You're walking up into Babylon, and as you start coming up, you see from miles away, you see these huge walls stretching up. 40 feet high perhaps, maybe even higher. Enormous walls. They take up the entire horizon of your view. You know you're in for something very different than what you're used to. You're not in Kansas anymore. They also have the Hanging Gardens, another one of the 7 wonders of the world. Babylon, the city, actually at one point had 2 points of interest on that list of the 7 wonders of the world. They have the Hanging Gardens, or at least it's reported so. There's some debate over whether that was accurate, but the historical perspective is basically that they had these hanging gardens, that the king of Babylon had married a woman who was from the country, and she didn't like this big city, and so she wanted it, and so he recreated the country in Babylon. Had this enormous nature preserve, vertical one, huge, tall one, with all the different plants and water cascading down and ways of getting the water to the top. And so that's what you were coming into, a city that had a thing like that sitting in there. You had the ziggurat, what we know as the Tower of Babel, a huge temple to their god Marduk, 300 feet high. So here you have this huge city, huge walls, this beautiful hanging garden sticking up in the air, and then standing up right out, and looking like it could pierce the sky from the perspective of a young boy who had never seen anything that tall in his life. You have this enormous temple to this god. 300-foot square base, 300-foot tall tower sticking up. And that's just their construction. Not to mention all of the aqueduct system and all of the technologies they developed to run that city, to keep it afloat. And then you have their scientific endeavor that you get in. You start getting into Babylon, you start realizing this is a very different place. And we today, if you want to understand just how technologically advanced they were for their time, Babylon, we today still have much of their technology present with us. That's right. Anybody who has a watch or a clock or a phone is using Babylonian technology. Why are there 60 seconds in a minute? Why are there 60 minutes in an hour? Because Babylonians counted by 60s. So they divided the hour into 60 minutes, and the minute into 60 seconds. And they divided the circle into 360 degrees. Why is our circle divided into 360 degrees and not 100 or 1,000, which would seem to make more decimal sense, right? Because they counted by 60s. And 360 is a multiple of 60. So if you use GPS on your phone, you are still using some of Babylon's technologies. This is a very technologically advanced civilization. They had the ancient code of Hammurabi, very advanced legal code for its time. So this is not a lawless city. This is a city that has laws, and these laws are very much like the laws of Moses, so much so that some historians believe that Moses got his laws from Hammurabi. They have a creation myth. They have a whole story about how creation might have happened. They have a story about the flood and how the world perished in a great flood. So you're talking about a civilization. This is not a murderous tribe that just happened to get lucky and take away some people. This is a highly advanced society that Daniel is walking into. This is a society that's in many ways very religious. They had more than 1,500 gods, the Babylonians did. But their gods were very different than the Jewish gods. Daniel is coming from a place that worships, like we said, in a temple in which there is no God, which is a very unique thing about the Jewish religion. So when you went into any pagan temple, in the front of that pagan temple is going to be a statue of the god of the temple. I just went to Mexico just recently, and we went down to Progreso, Mexico, and they have a small little ruins there. I'm not sure they're authentic, but we're going to pretend they were. And they had a small little pyramid there, and on that pyramid they had their little gods set up. And they had the moon god and the sun god. And that's what you'd expect to see in every temple you walk into. But when you walk into the Jewish temple, there are no gods. There's no images, because they worship an invisible God. Very unique in that time. Well, here's Daniel, who's come from a lifetime of monotheism, a lifetime of worshiping one true God, an invisible God, with the spirit, not with the eyes, not with the hands. And he's coming into this city that is completely saturated with gods. There's gods everywhere. Temples everywhere. Every corner has a little hollow carved out in the wall with a little god in it that represents something. And all of these gods represent the forces of nature. And one of the interesting things about the Babylonian gods is they didn't think of them as being categorically different than themselves. They just thought they were better versions of themselves. In other words, they saw the gods as being essentially superhumans. Humans, but superhumans, who had more power than the average human. So they didn't conceptualize them as being in nature different, just in degrees. And they had thousands of these gods. And they didn't believe that any one of them was supreme, because logically that would destroy polytheism. The moment you say that there is one supreme being, polytheism falls apart. If you have one God who is supreme, then what do you need any other God for? And so all these gods are competing gods and warring gods. And that's how they would answer things like earthquakes and thunderstorms. These are gods that are warring, because you have the God of thunder, the God of the sky, the God of the earth. You have the God of the seas. And they're fighting, and this fighting is causing our troubles, our famines, our earthquakes, our problems. And this is a society that Daniel is coming into. And there's a sense in which the Babylonians were using this religious framework to conceptualize and communicate a naturalistic worldview. And this is something we need to understand. We tend to think of naturalism as something that started in the 19th century or the 20th century, but that really is not the case. Pagan religion is at its heart naturalism, not religion. It's very important to understand this. I know that scientists think that in the 20th century they sprung out of nothing, the way they think the world sprang out of nothing. They think they owe nothing to anything before them. And that's simply not a true statement. Pagan religions are at their heart naturalistic. And the goal of them is to find some explanation for natural occurrences. And that's why the gods of the Babylonians were all personified natural forces. So for instance, you had Anu, the god of heaven. You had Bel, the god of earth and mankind. You had Ea, the god of the abyss of water. You had Sin, the god of the moon. Shamash, the god of the sun. Ramam, the god of atmosphere. You had Adad, the god of the storms. You had Marduk, who was their main god, in a way, because he was the god of the city of Babylon. He was the god of compassion, healing, magic, fairness, and eventually was called the king of gods. And that's his temple was the Tower of Babel, was the temple of Marduk. You had Nabu, the god of wisdom, of learning, of knowledge. And you had the very singular Ishtar, who was a goddess. Most of the goddesses of the pagan religions are of very little consequence, but Ishtar is one of the few exceptions to this. She was the god both of love, sex, and war. And these are all the gods that you have. And they have a lot more. These are just some of the main ones. So Babylon is saturated with paganism. It's saturated with these gods and with this pagan religion that is really, at its core, a naturalistic worldview. A view that the world can be completely explained by what humans can do and the forces of nature. Every one of their gods was basically a human who was just a little smarter or a little more powerful than they were. And they could explain the entire world through a humanistic and naturalistic worldview. Very much like our time. If you go and you listen to secular scientists, secular philosophers, they will tell you that you can explain your entire existence with humanism, naturalism. And while they may not call their god Nabu or Marduk or Ishtar, they have names for their gods also. They have equality and equity. They have evolution, right? Selection, natural selection. These are nothing more than names of a god that has superhuman, not divine, superhuman power. You have to understand that the God of the Jews who is the God of the Christians, does not have superhuman power. He is divine. The God of the Bible is never presented as being a little bigger than you or a little better than you. He is categorically better, categorically bigger. The gods of the Babylonians, we could say, were better than the Babylonians in the way that you could say that a Mercedes-Benz is better than a Chevy. The God of the Bible is better than you in the way we could say that life is better than a Chevy. It is not an in-category comparison.
That's right.
This is what Daniel is coming into. We have to understand that fundamentally, Daniel is a person who has a view of God as being a different existence altogether. That God exists not greater than me, but completely outside my entire dimension. That his thoughts cannot be comprehended, not because he's smarter, but because he thinks entirely different than I think. And he's coming into a society that does not believe that even exists. The Babylonians believed that they could explain everything with a humanistic and naturalistic worldview. He walks in, he's coming down the main road into Babylon, and the first thing you see when you get close enough to make out detail in Babylon is the gate of Ishtar, the main gate into Babylon. You can see that gate today. In the 1930s, 1920s, and 1930s, a number of archaeologists went to Iraq and excavated this gate and reconstructed it in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. And they actually have most of it, or almost all of it, and they just don't have a museum big enough to house it in. It's not, they have only the first part of it, the short part, which is like 40 feet high. That's all they have, but they have it reconstructed with the original face brick that they got out of it with ones they could, and then they've reconstituted ones that had been broken. But they have it, and it's this beautiful gate. If you haven't seen it, you can go online and look at it. It's this bright blue gleaming gate. They took brick and they glazed it and they fired it, and so the sun would shine and reflect off of it, and there's this brilliant royal blue beautiful thing covered with all these images of their three main gods. You have the dragon of Marduk, you have the bull of Adad, and you have the lion of Ishtar, and the gate is called the gate of Ishtar. You go through that huge gate, and past that gate, you have a 300-foot long, 60-foot wide avenue called Procession Way. This is their main procession way. This is their main avenue. It is like what they've done with the White House in our country in a way. It is made to intimidate their guests. When you walk in, you see this bright, gleaming, tall gate, one like you've never seen before in your life. And then you walk in and you're on a street that's 60 feet wide, and it's lined with 60 lions, ferocious-looking lions carved out of rock down the length of that, and it goes right down and ends on the Euphrates. It's very important to understand what that even symbolizes, both for the Babylonians and for Daniel walking into it. So Ishtar is an interesting goddess. Ishtar is the god of sex. And the temple of Ishtar had a very peculiar ritual that everyone in Babylon had to participate in. Every woman in Babylon at some point in her life was required to pay her duty to Ishtar, and that was to go up to the temple of Ishtar, sit there until a man, whichever stranger walked by, he caught his eye, and he would throw coins into her lap. And she had to go have sexual intercourse with him. That was her sacred duty to the god Ishtar. An entire religion founded around prostitution, founded around a morbid and twisted view of human sexuality. And then they named their principal gate Ishtar. She became the premier god or goddess of the civilization. And that's what Daniel's walking into. This may have been a very technologically advanced civilization, but it was a morally bankrupt civilization.
That's right.
As great as they were in technology, they were equally horrible in ethics and morals. Because everything for them was humanism and naturalism.
That's right.
There was no divine spark that would constrain them to say no to their basest desires. Why would they? Everything can be explained naturally, and anything, therefore, that is natural is good. And so, if animals can behave this way sexually, it's natural. So humans can too. And this is the civilization that Daniel is walking into. 13-year-old, very impressionable, frightened young man. And it's not a coincidence that they marched them through the Ishtar Gate. That is the rite of passage into the Babylonian society. Everyone is required to participate in these things. And we find out that this type of religious intolerance runs deep throughout Babylon. There is no freedom of religion there. Everybody has to participate. When later on in the story Nebuchadnezzar raises up his golden image, everybody has to bow. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your status is. Same way with the cult of Ishtar. This just wasn't for poor women. This wasn't for slave women. Herodotus, one of the historian of that time, writes and says that this is all women, even women that come to the temple to pay their sacred duty. They come in chariots drawn by horses and guarded by guards because they're of such high status in the society, and they have to also come and pay their sacred duty to that god. Nobody's exempt. There's no enclave for Daniel. There's no place where Daniel and his friends can go and say, we don't believe in these things. They are pushed immediately. They are drugged through the gate of Ishtar, down procession way, and presented to the temples of those gods. This isn't even as good as Athens when Paul's walking around. He at least sees one image that says, to the unknown God. Now, there is no representation for Christianity. There is no representation for Judaism. There is no place for his beliefs or his convictions. I want you to think about for a moment the impact that polytheism has. When we think about Daniel and his natural habitat, Jerusalem, and its monotheistic culture, there's a lot of advantages to monotheism. For instance, it gives you something to have national unity around, which is very important for a nation. You ever thought about what joins nations together? There's a reason why Babylon and Rome were not precisely nations. It's very hard to pull a nation together, as our Civil War demonstrates, right? I mean, even before then, go back and read the histories of the American Constitutional Convention and all the fighting and bickering and arguing between these different states, which at that time, the states were nations. Virginia, all of these were essentially their own countries, and they're trying to come together as a single nation. That is extraordinarily difficult to accomplish. Most places never do it. It's one of the fallacies of us trying to do nation building around the world. I don't think we actually realize how hard that is. So Babylon wasn't actually a nation, it was a city One city. Rome, that ruled the world, was one city, a small city, a very homogeneous city. They all shared a lot of things in common. When you get a nation, a lot of cities, with all different views, that's hard to bring those people together. So monotheism was something that which the Israel nation, the Jewish nation, could come around in national unity. All of their differences they might have between the 12 tribes, they all served one God. Very important. And it gave them shared values. They not only served one God, they believed in one creed. And for the Jews, that could probably be best summed up in the Ten Commandments. They believed in an absolute morality. There were things that were right and there were things that were wrong. It didn't matter if you were from Judah or if you were from Benjamin. It didn't matter if you were from the north or the south. There are things that are wrong and there are things that are right. Babylonians had none of this. That's the problem with polytheism. When we start having many gods, any hope of unity is gone. How is it that our nation was able to come together? Well, it was because we came together under God. Yeah, that's right. It's in our creed as a nation. One nation, under God, indivisible. The moment we are no longer coming together under a single monotheistic God, we will find it impossible to maintain unity. That's right. And this doesn't have to be pagan gods that we're talking about. The God of science, the God of identity politics, the God of ideologies, all of those are sufficient. That's right. What happens when you don't have monotheistic unity as a people? Well, then you have to find something else to unify around. And so you end up with ethnic superiority like the Nazis. That was how they unified a very disunified German nation. Ethnic superiority. That was their monotheistic God. Or you get equity like the Soviets. And we could go through a lot of other examples in history of ideologies that become the God because we've lost the monotheistic religion that we had. So what you end up with is a completely baseless morality that is contingent upon what feels right, because that is essentially the consumer version of naturalism, is doing what feels right. And you end up with a society like the Babylonians. So imagine Daniel and his friends. Again, they're young, they're impressionable, they're frightened, they're uncertain about their future. They've come from what they thought was a great place and a great city, and they're looking at Babylon, glistening, gleaming, enormous, green, lush. The river Euphrates runs right down the center of it. They have a culture where anything goes. It's like a candy factory for a young boy. And everything he's ever believed is being put to the test. Everything he thought was right in this city looks like it might be wrong. And everything he thought was wrong in this city is not only right, it's required. And he has no choice in the matter. He didn't choose to go to Babylon. He's not like Lot that looked at the options and said, I like Sodom. He's led there against his will. Quite a shock. I would imagine Daniel's first night in Babylon was quite a shock. I imagine that the people in charge of taking care of Daniel were telling him, young man, you shouldn't be sad. This is going to be the best time of your life. You finally got free of that stifling religion. You finally got free of that invisible God. You finally got free of those 10 commandments and that rigid structure. We're going to take you down to the temple of Ishtar tomorrow. You're going to enjoy yourself. Don't you worry, you're going to forget all about that Jehovah. A night at the temple of Ishtar and all that's just going to fade away. You don't have to worry about it no more. All this praying and fasting nonsense. We're going to feed you the best food. The king is going to give you his own personal chef, is going to make you whatever your heart desires. You're going to take a little bit of that food and drink a little bit of that wine. In Jerusalem, Zion is just going to fade away. You're going to get your hands on our books and our knowledge and our wisdom. You're going to find out that all these things that you've been attributing to divine intervention, they're just natural. They just happen. And you are much bigger and stronger than you thought you were. You're practically a god in Babylon. Don't you worry about it, Daniel. You're sad tonight, but tomorrow, things are going to start looking up for you. How many of us would have, if the book was called the book of Mike instead of the book of Daniel, or if the book was called the book of Jessica or Kelly or Andrew, I wonder how that book would have ended. I wonder if we would have made it to our 80th year of life and still had the tenacity and religious conviction to say, throw me into the den of lions, I will not capitulate to Babylon. I wonder. Or might that book have been a lot shorter? Well, you and I have already walked through the gate of Ishtar. We've already walked all the way down Procession Way. We're all in Babylon now. And you and I are confronting the same humanistic and naturalistic worldview that Daniel confronted. And we all have the same choices to make. So maybe, just maybe, might want to read the book of Daniel. Find out how Daniel handled that situation. We'll talk about more of that next week. Have a good day.